What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some more Pillars of Eternity and soon-to-be Avowed lore, this time about the Society of Engwith, or the Engwithans, as they are commonly referred to as. Now, before we jump into any of this, huge spoilers for both of the games, really. In fact, basically the first sentence that I get into is a huge spoiler for the first game, so with that out of the way, if you haven't actually played through that game or you don't want those spoilers, now is the time to click off, because this next sentence is a huge spoiler for those games. The Engwithans are the civilization that eventually turned themselves into the gods of Eora, which is of course the big reveal of the first game. Now, while between that and the ruins you find, you might think of this society as some super advanced civilization, and actually that's not really true. The only thing specifically that the Engwithans had an absolute mastery of was animancy, which is the study of souls, which I have a separate video about if you want to go check that out. But beyond that, they were actually not necessarily as advanced as other people of the time. In fact, modern civilizations have surpassed a lot of what the Engwithans knew. The only real thing Engwithans were absolutely better than everyone at, even by the standards of the societies in-game, which are about 2,000 years after the fact, is animancy. But with that out of the way, let's talk about Engwithan society from start to end. Now, the actual civilization came to be around 100 to 200 AI. Put that in perspective, the second game takes place in the year 2828 AI, about 5 years after the first game. Now, structurally speaking, there were a couple different Engwith kingdoms. They all operated largely independently with a sort of figurehead that largely acted as a dictator. We see this in Oddnua in the first game, who was the master of Cadnua, which is your fortress. But that was also Oddnua's ruling place, and that's where he operated the Engwith society from, in that particular region. Now, Oddnua is especially important to Engwith society, because at some point his son Merosnua dies. This specific instance drives Oddnua insane. He starts committing atrocities while studying animancy to try to revive his son. And while the things he did were terrible, they actually fueled a lot of important advances in animancy that became the backbone of later research. But that said, Oddnua was eventually put down by the other rulers of Engwith society who viewed him as a threat because of the things he was doing. What followed is centuries of research. So keep in mind, this is around the origins of Engwith society, which again is around 100 to 200 AI. And their apotheosis into gods is estimated to take place sometime around 600 AI. So we're talking anywhere between 4 and 5 centuries worth of research follows Oddnua's death. Because during this period, there's a ton of religious war happening, where basically every various society believes in different gods or idols, and they fight each other over it. Engwith included, they actually fought several of these wars themselves. Fueled by these wars, they start using animancy to study the very fabric of the universe, and start trying to answer that question, do gods even exist? And this is where Engwith stumbles upon the most important discovery of their entire society. And that is simply that if there were gods, they're gone. That nothing is out there controlling the wheel. Because, keep in mind, the wheel is just a natural part of life. It's happening. Engwith is aware it happens. It's very unregulated. But the wheel exists, which is the cycle of life and death in this universe. So upon discovering that there's nothing out there, what Engwith as a society chooses to do is make 11 gods out of common legends and fables and things to give meaning to the turning of the wheel and trying to put an end to all this religious warfare that is resulting in just absolute devastation across the place. Now, this is where we start to see the independent kingdoms of Engwith operate kind of as one unit. These societies are largely spread around the Eastern Reach area, which is kind of the setting of the first game, as well as the Deadfire Archipelago, which is the setting, of course, of the second game. Now, 2 very important places were built in each of those areas. Well, 1 each, I should say. In the Deerwood, Sun and Shadow is set up. This is where the actual physical apotheosis into gods takes place. And then in Ukaizo, in the Deadfire Archipelago, is where they built the machinery that actually regulates the wheel. But upon making their big discovery, they start setting up all this machinery essentially to make themselves gods, to engineer gods. And while their gods would still be as false as any others, their gods would have the benefit of being real. So as I mentioned earlier, around 600 AI, Theos Ix Arcanon himself leads this apotheosis, whatever you want to call it, into godhood for Engwith. Now Theos was chosen to be the go-between, so to speak, between the gods and the physical world of Eora. Theos' job is to interpret the commands of Woedica, who was supposed to be the queen of the gods, and translate that into teachings and spreading their faith that they just created into the world. Theos leads these sacrifices of Engwithans to form the gods. So as we learn in the first game, this takes place at Sun and Shadow, which is kind of the end Engwithan ruin you find yourself in. Theos uses this area to sacrifice untold amounts of Engwithans and take their souls and use their machinery to coalesce those souls into gods. And this is how the 11 gods of Eora were formed. It would be easy to say that's it, that's the story of Engwith, but that is of course not actually where it ends. Because while a great number of their society was sacrificed to make these gods, it was not all of them. There were remnants of this civilization. Now, what's left of their civilization devoted themselves to spreading this new faith around the land and putting an end to all those religious wars we mentioned earlier. This also had the side benefit of correcting all the soul maladies that were associated with the wheel, because the wheel, unregulated as it was, often caused what are called soul maladies, which are various illnesses where people are driven insane or they're just born without souls, that kind of thing. I also have a video about those if you're interested. But in addition to agreeing to spread this faith, these Engwithans actually chose to die childless to protect their secret, or at least the missionaries did. And I say just the missionaries because we know that the last of the actual Engwithan society actually kind of finally died out in its entirety in 1300 AI. And this is where they socially engineered the Glandfathen tribes that we see in the first game to migrate to the Tir Evron area, and they use a sort of deal struck to wind up kind of engineering this cultural thing where the Glandfathens see it as their duty and responsibility as a culture to protect the Engwithans, or the builders as they call them, their ruins, so people never go into them, and thus further protect their secret of having turned themselves into gods. And that is kind of where we see the last of the Engwithan society. Now that said, I do want to mention that the White March DLC does add a little more context to what happened to all the ruins. If you're unaware, the White March DLC sees us learn that Andra actually threw the moon at the Deerwood and Archipelago area of Eora, and this is what destroyed most of the Engwithan ruins. However, because of Abaddon's sacrifice and taking the brunt of the blow of the moon himself, he actually is low-key the reason that some of the ruins still remain, because it was Andra's intention to destroy the entirety of what was visible evidence of the Engwithan society's existence. But that, guys, is everything I could pull together about the Engwithan society and their very broad sweeping actions that affected the entirety of the world of Eora. So with that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to contribute to the channel and help me make more videos like this, please consider joining the channel as a member or purchasing something from my merch shop. There's a link to that down below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.